Inflation is a word that's been creeping into daily conversations, affecting every aspect of our lives, from groceries to gas prices. What if everything you once thought was affordable suddenly became out of reach? In America, the inflation epidemic is becoming more than just a buzzword. It's a real, tangible force that is reshaping the economy and the lives of millions of people. It's a crisis that stretches far beyond simple price increases. As inflation impacts everything from wages to home ownership, it's clear that America's future is at a crossroads. The question is, what does the future look like when inflation becomes a persistent problem? The rising cost of living has hit Americans hard. Imagine your paycheck shrinking while the cost of living skyrockets. What happens when your income can't keep up? In the past few years, inflation has consistently outpaced wage growth, meaning many people are earning more money but are not able to buy as much with it. For families, this means fewer luxuries, tighter budgets, and often tough decisions. Basic necessities like food, rent, and healthcare have become more expensive. And the American dream of home ownership is slipping further away from those who once thought it was achievable. How will this change the aspirations of future generations? But it's not just individuals feeling the weight of inflation, it's businesses too. What if businesses could no longer afford to offer the same products or services, forcing layoffs and bankruptcies? Small businesses, in particular, are struggling to keep their doors open, as supply chain disruptions and increased production costs make it harder to maintain profit margins. For many, passing on those increased costs to consumers isn't an option, but failing to do so means absorbing financial losses. In some cases, businesses are being forced to cut back on hours, reduce their workforce, or even shut down completely. How long can these businesses survive before inflation takes a permanent toll? The housing market is another area where inflation is wreaking havoc. What if owning a home becomes an impossible dream for the next generation? Housing prices have reached unprecedented levels, driven by soaring demand and limited supply. For many Americans, this has meant either being priced out of desirable neighborhoods or settling for homes that don't meet their needs. First-time buyers are finding it increasingly difficult to scrape together enough money for a down payment, while the affordability gap widens. How much longer can the average American dream of owning a home be sustained in such an environment? And what does this mean for future generations who may never know the comfort of homeownership? At the same time, inflation is affecting the stock market and investment strategies. What if your retirement savings are slowly being eaten away by inflation, leaving you with far less than you expected? Investors are feeling the pressure as inflation continues to chip away at the value of their portfolios. While the stock market might seem like a safe haven for wealth, inflation's impact on long-term returns is undeniable. The traditional investment strategies that have worked for decades are now being tested in an environment where inflation is high and interest rates are rising. The question is, how can people protect their wealth in a time of such uncertainty? And what will happen to those who are nearing retirement with little cushion to fall back on? In the political sphere, inflation has become a hot-button issue. What if the government's efforts to curb inflation only make things worse? The Federal Reserve's attempts to combat inflation by raising interest rates have led to rising costs of borrowing, making it more expensive for Americans to take out loans, buy homes, or finance big-ticket items. This, in turn, can cause a slowdown in the economy, leading to increased unemployment and even deeper economic instability. While politicians argue over the best ways to combat inflation, many are left wondering, will any policy truly solve the underlying problems? Or will inflation continue to spiral out of control? If you're enjoying this video so far, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe so you stay updated with all our latest content. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. But inflation isn't just an economic issue, it's a social one too. How will inflation deepen the divide between the rich and the poor, exacerbating inequality in America? As prices rise, those at the lower end of the economic spectrum are hit hardest. With limited disposable income, many low-income families are forced to make difficult choices, prioritizing basic needs like food and healthcare, while cutting back on things like education, savings, or even leisure activities. Meanwhile, the wealthy are often insulated from the worst effects of inflation, continuing to thrive on investments and assets that appreciate even as everyday goods become more expensive. How much more can this growing wealth gap be stretched before social unrest boils over? One of the most concerning aspects of inflation is its impact on healthcare. What if rising healthcare costs mean millions of Americans can't afford the treatment they need? As the cost of healthcare increases, many people find themselves unable to afford medical care, even with insurance. For some, this leads to deferred treatments, worsening health outcomes, or relying on less effective alternatives. The disparity in healthcare access, already a significant issue in the US, is becoming even more pronounced as inflation puts critical services further out of reach. If these trends continue, what will the future of healthcare look like for the average American? And will the government step in to provide relief before the system collapses? Education is also feeling the effects of inflation. What if the dream of higher education becomes unattainable for most American families? The rising cost of tuition, coupled with inflation's impact on family budgets, means that college and university are becoming increasingly inaccessible. For many students, the prospect of taking on massive student loan debt is becoming a reality just to afford a college education. The rise in costs isn't just a burden on families, it's also limiting the future economic mobility of young Americans. If inflation continues to push educational costs out of reach, what happens to the American workforce and the next generation of innovators, scientists, and leaders? The global economy is another factor that cannot be ignored in the discussion of inflation. What if the global supply chain disruption continues to fuel inflation for years to come? As we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, the global supply chain is fragile and vulnerable to disruption. Shortages of goods, along with increased demand, are major drivers of inflation in many sectors, including food, clothing, and electronics. These disruptions may not be temporary either. Ongoing geopolitical tensions, climate change, and other global issues could keep supply chains in turmoil, driving prices even higher. How can America navigate this landscape when inflation is tied not just to domestic policy, but to international events beyond our control? While the economic impact of inflation is clear, it also raises deeper questions about the future of American society. What if inflation becomes a permanent fixture, altering the very way we live and work in America? As the costs of basic needs rise and wealth becomes more concentrated in the hands of the few, what happens to the social fabric of the nation? Will we see an increase in poverty, unemployment, and social unrest? Or will new technologies, economic policies, and global cooperation help us find a way out of this spiral? The future is uncertain, but one thing is clear. The inflation epidemic is a challenge that America cannot ignore. It will require innovative solutions, hard decisions, and a collective effort to rebuild the economy and society in a way that benefits all Americans. The question remains, can we rise to the challenge before it's too late? Thank you for watching. If you found this video insightful, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on our latest content. Stay tuned for more updates.